Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Katie Rowley. I am the Outreach Librarian for the NOAA Central Library, and we're very excited to have you here as part of our Open Access Week. The theme this year is Open for Climate Justice, and we have a special webinar focusing on open science. Some logistics to get through first. As an attendee, you are muted for this presentation. If you have a question, and we really hope you have questions, please put those in the question panel and we will answer them either throughout or at the end of the presentation. Also, we are recording this presentation, so if you do need to step away or if you want to share this with a colleague later or you just need to revisit because you missed something during the live portion, that's totally fine. The library is recording it and putting it up on our YouTube channel. Also, lastly, since we are recording everything, anything that you put in the question panel, be that a question or a comment, will be recorded so we can follow up with you afterwards, but we do not keep that information. Okay. I would like to introduce our speakers today. We have Jennifer Fagan-Fry, who is the NOAA Institutional Repository Manager and sits within the NOAA Central Library. And we have Sarah Davis, who's our Senior Bibliometrics Librarian, also in NOAA Central Library. And this is their presentation, Small Steps, Big Impact, Supporting Open Science Through Access and Data Initiatives. Jen, take it away.
Thanks, Katie. One other logistical thing, we will make these slides available for everyone, so Katie can send those out during or when she sends the follow-up email. We'll also make them available via the YouTube channel in the comments. We'll link them there for folks as well. So those will be available after. We do have some links in here, and so people can access them and share them freely once they're done. So with that, I am going to turn off my camera while I'm speaking just to not bog down the webinar. And we will hop right into everything. If there's any issues with my screen or anything, Katie, just holler at me and let me know. So I'm going to dive right in, and we're just going to start talking about what is open science. So open science is the movement to make scientific research accessible to all levels of society, whether it's amateur, professional, and everywhere in between. The purpose is to make science more transparent and accessible. It seems pretty obvious, right? It does help speed scientific inquiry and discovery. Another main goal of open science is to reduce duplication in terms of collecting data or transferring, reusing scientific material, but also to spur innovation. So there's a lot of misconceptions when it comes to open science and open access. Oftentimes people will use these terms interchangeably. They are not one and the same. Open access is just merely an element of open science. And as you can see here through this diagram that Sarah has so graciously created for us, it's just one element. There's, 6 sort of rough categories within open science. So what I'm going to do is kind of go through each of these. The first one being open peer review. So what does that mean? The definitions of open peer review can kind of vary, and there's a number of models, but they all sort of have a few similar characteristics in that portions of the peer review process are made publicly available. So what does that exactly look like? What do we mean portions of the peer review process? Well, sometimes authors and publishers will make commenting available on items that are in review. They will make the comments from reviewers publicly available, sometimes before, but usually after publication. Oftentimes, this will also look like sharing author or reviewer contact information or what they specifically said. Sometimes that also includes having open discussions between the authors and the reviewers when it comes to edits or requests for more information when they're doing the review process. The next area is open source. I think a lot of people know what open source is, but just in case, open source typically is used in terms of software development. This is where we make the code free to download, modify, share. There's sort of this concept of peer production, I have here in quotes, of the code and documentation blueprints. It's a way to make all of this freely available and keep things out of proprietary hands, where if it's open source software, more people will have access to it without the barrier of having to pay for a specific software. The next one would be open methodology. This is a matter of making the methods that you use to conduct your research as available as possible so folks can critique them, do replication studies, things of that nature. It's sort of the most obvious and kind of easiest one. A lot of research papers have methodology sections, right? So part of that filters into this open methodology. The next one would be open data, and there's sort of three key principles about open data. These are availability and access. So that's making sure data is made available in whole and in convenient and easy to access formats. The second would be reuse and redistribution. So that's making sure data is provided under terms that allow for sharing, allow for reuse, allow for redistribution, remixing, those sorts of things. And then the last would be universal participation. And I think sometimes this gets a little, I don't want to say blown past, but there's some key things in this, in universal participation, that I think some folks don't always think about. And specifically, this is ensuring that everyone has access to this, regardless of status. So there's no discrimination in who can and cannot access that data. And I think the best example of this, and one that's commonly used in the literature, is when folks place restrictions for non-commercial use only, saying that, if you're going to use this for commercial purposes, you're unable to do so. And that sort of goes against some of the core tenets of open data and open science as a whole. Anyone and everyone, regardless of whether they're going to use it for commercial purposes or not, should still have access to that data. Oh, sorry. The next one would be open educational resources. So these are putting learning materials, teaching materials, those sorts of things, and technology. So this could incorporate some of your open source software into the public domain with the distinct and specific ability to reuse, remix, redistribute those resources. And then finally, the last one is open access, which is sort of what we're here for today. What I'd like to do, though, is sort of break open access down into some of the nuances. I mean, typically we know that this is making publications freely accessible, but what exactly does that mean? There's sort of some bits and pieces to it that I think it's important for us to cover. So first and foremost, there's two primary types of open access. There's a couple others, but these are the two primary and most common types of open access: gold and green. Gold open access would be the full and immediate access to the publisher's version of the article. So this means that article is free to readers. They do not have to have a subscription. It's not behind what's commonly called a paywall. Folks can just access this, read that content, download that content, and access it without any sort of barriers. Oftentimes when it comes to gold open access, authors are charged a fee for publishing. So this is an APC, an article processing charge. And if folks we'll get into that a little bit later on down the road, but if you have questions, please let us know. Like Katie said, put them in the question panel and we can address some of that too. Gold open access publications typically have a license attached, and we'll get into licenses in a minute. But they typically have what's called a Creative Commons license attached to them. Green open access is different. This is oftentimes referred to as self-archiving. So if you have ever published with a publisher, sometimes they have in their agreements discussions of an author's ability to self-archive. This would be green open access. Essentially what you're doing is taking your author accepted manuscript version. So that's the version that's post peer reviewed, but it does not have publisher formatting attached to it. So sort of that reviewed, revised version of the manuscript that you send back to the publisher. That is what we are posting in an agency or an institutional repository. So something you would post in the NOAA IR or your academic institution's repository. Authors also have the ability to take that version and post it on their websites. The publisher's version, though, is the one that's available on the publisher's website, and that is the only place it is available. So the publisher version or version of record, VOR, we sort of use those terms interchangeably because they are. That particular version is only available on the publisher's website, and oftentimes you have to have a subscription to access that. And we'll get into what I mean by that oftentimes in a minute. So you would have to have a subscription, but that manuscript is what is openly available. So I had mentioned under Gold OA that licenses are usually involved, and there's different types and categories of licenses. These are all Creative Commons licenses, and what I thought we would do is sort of go through these and talk about them in terms of the most permissive and open to the least open, the most restrictive. So the first and most open is public domain. That's a CC0 Creative Commons license. This is when you list something with a public domain license, that means it is free to use, download, remix, transform, make derivatives of, redistribute. It is out there for anyone and everyone to touch. Public domain is used a lot when we as federal employees are publishing anything, making documents available. All of our NOAA publications are in the public domain. They are licensed under a Creative Commons 0 license. The next most open license would be a CC BY. This allows for distribution, remixing, adapting. This is the next most open. This is the one when we're talking about gold open access, you'll most commonly see a CC BY in that. There is a secondary sort of subcategory of CC BY that is called a CC BY SA, the SA standing for share alike. That means that if you put something out and you license it under a CC BY, and then someone decides they want to take that and make a derivative of it, let's say, what they have to do then in that instance is they have to A, give you attribution, and B, share it in a similar format. So they would also have to share it in a CC or license it, with a CC BY license. That's what the SA designation means. The next step down would be a CC BY NC, the NC standing for non-commercial use only. So now we're getting into where we're restricting certain communities or statuses from being able to fully access that content. Again, there is a sort of subcategory with the CC BY NCSA that again is that share alike. So you'd have to also share that derivative or transformed publication or research product in the same sort of license. And then there's CC BY ND, which that is no derivatives, so no adaptations, no derivatives. You can still use, reuse, redistribute, but you cannot do any adaptations. You can't really do any remixing or derive something from that. And then the most restrictive would be a CC BY NCND, so non-commercial, non-derivative uses only. So that's the most restrictive. So why does open access matter as a whole? So we have this nice little sort of flow chart in a way. Open access in terms of researchers and the research itself leads to more visible. If you publish something in an open access realm, your item is going to be more easily discoverable, more visibility. That leads you to more citations. More people getting their eyes on your work means they're going to use that work more. The more citations you have, the bigger impact you have. The bigger impact you have, the more collaboration you'll be able to explore. People will seek you out to work with you on things, to talk to you about things, to get your opinion on things. And in that itself can lead to more representation. So it's sort of a nice circle of open access can lead to better collaboration, impact, and representation. So In talking about open access, and because we are a federal entity, things always come up about public access mandates, public access requirements, specifically the OSTP requirements. So I thought we could take this time to kind of talk about the current state of those public access, those OSTP requirements and public access mandates, and also sort of how they fit into open access and open science as a whole. So a brief history for those who may or may not be familiar. The OSTP is the Office of Science and Technology Policy. They initially released a memo back in 2013 called Increasing Access to the Results of Federally Funded Scientific Research. It's a mouthful. It's often called the the Holdren Memo, or sometimes we'll say the OSTP 2013 memo. The crux of it was agencies who do more than $100 million in research annually have to create and make a plan to make all of those research results public. When we talk about research results, we're talking about publications and data. It was intended to apply to federal employees, but specifically it also called out grantees and folks who get federal awards. So in response to that, NOAA created the NOAA Plan for Increasing Public Access to Research Results, or the NOAA PAR Plan. That was finalized in 2015. Much like the memo, it covers scientific publications and data. It does cover all of our FTEs, contract and grantees. So everyone is subject to that plan. And within that plan is where the creation of the NOAA Institutional Repository was designated within that plan. Most recently, in August, specifically August 22nd of 2022, 25th, August 22nd or 25th of 2022, OSTP released a follow-up to that memo called Ensuring Free, Immediate, and Equitable Access to Federally Funded Research. The biggest things, and we'll go into it in a second here, is this is about increasing transparency, and there's going to be an iterative sort of aspect to it because the memo itself was iteratively developed with input from agencies, publishers were involved in this, and some outside community members and stakeholders were also also had feedback and input into what went into this memo. So specifically, I thought we could go over some of the key requirements that kind of fit in with the idea of open access and open science. First and foremost, the new memo calls for a zero embargo. So currently, with the NOAA Power Plan and the previous memo, there was a requirement in there that there would be a 12-month embargo on accepted manuscripts posted within agency repositories. With the new memo, they have removed that 12-month embargo. So we're calling it zero embargo. And that means when you send us a manuscript, we will immediately make it available in the repository. There will be no embargo period on that. The other big key thing in relation to publications that has come about in this memo is it is requiring us to provide, in addition to the PDF version of the manuscript or publisher's version if it's open access, we must also provide a machine readable version of that publication. So typically most people think of an XML file for that. There are a few other formats, maybe a JSON, in theory, HTML would qualify, but we do need to provide, in addition to that PDF, that machine readable version. In the new memo, it does explicitly state that publications must be made freely available by default in agency designated repositories. Within the original memo, it just said must be made available. It didn't necessarily dictate where. In the new memo, in the new update, it says that it must be in the agency designated repository, which for NOAA, that would be the NOAA IR. In terms of data, there's quite a few changes and requirements related to data, but the key things to keep in mind are that data associated with publications must be made available at the time of publication. In addition, Data not associated with publications will also need to be made available. However, OSTP has given agencies some leeway in sort of determining those timelines and how we will make that data available publicly. So the big takeaway here is that your data has to be made publicly available at the time of publication. So the day that you are publishing, that data has to be publicly available. And the last thing is persistent identifiers, which we've done a few webinars on those. We actually will have another one in November, I believe. Katie can correct me at the end of this talk if I'm incorrect on that, but I think we'll be doing another identifier webinar then. In terms of the memo, it is requiring that we implement persistent identifiers to track essentially all stages of the research life cycle, from awards to researchers to outputs. So what that means is we would need ORCIDs for researchers, DOIs or some sort of persistent identifier for awards and grants that are given out to folks, not to mention DOIs for your data set, for your publication, whatever that may be. So we're being transparent. NOAA currently is working on our response. The memo itself has a number of timelines, and I've laid these out here. So currently there is an informal team led by the Chief Data Officer, Tony Lavoie, and the Library Director, Dee Clarkin. There are a few other people who have been involved in this, but mostly this has been a group. One of them are the NIMF's information architect, Karen Sender, who is also, in addition to the library director, the representatives to the subcommittee on open science, which is a division of OSTP. They are the three key people, have been working to sort of coordinate efforts between the NOAA Science Council and the NOSC. So right now, the informal team is working with the Science Council and the NOSC to establish a joint working group in order to make these PAR revisions. So like I said before, it's going to be an iterative process. There's multiple deadlines that are laid out in that memo, one as early as February of 2023. There's some in 2024 and 2026 with a final implementation of the plan in 2027. So that has to be, the plan itself has to be submitted in December of 2026 with our full implementation done by 2027. So there's a lot there, and there are things in the works right now to establish that working group. What we have done is it's linked here. Again, we'll send this out so folks can get access to it, but I think Katie has access to this and can drop it in the chat. There, we've established a guide, the 2022 OSTP and PAR update implementation. This is a LibGuide that we are hosting in the library, and it's there to provide information on the requirements, on NOAA's response, and something we plan to keep updated throughout. So as that working group gets started, whatever their steps are, whatever the process is, we're going to be able to show everyone what that is through this guide and keep everyone informed. So I bring all of this up because it does factor into open access and some of those concepts. As you can see, things like a zero embargo, making your data available upon publication. This is all sort of tied into open science, and really at the heart of these memos from OSTP and sort of other policies and directives that have come down, like the Open Data Act, and things like that. At the heart of these is the idea of open science and making sure the research that we are doing is as available to the public, to the taxpayers as possible, not just because it's a good thing to do and sort of being responsible with taxpayer funds, but also it's what's good for the science. It spurs that innovation. It spurs that the it spurs the science, it spurs the innovation, and it spurs the creation of all of these research products. So with that, what I'm going to do is toss it over to Sarah to talk specifically about your role and authors and researchers' role in open science. Sarah?
Thank you, Jen. If we can go ahead and move to the next slide. Thank you. So there are a whole host of things that you can do to help support open science and participate, and you don't have to do all of them, but here are a number of suggestions and methods. So my personal favorite is registering for an ORCID, and maintaining your profile and using that ID on all publications, data sets, and your other research outputs. Persistent IDs are something of a linchpin in open science and really facilitate linking and identifying various research projects and creating this sort of universe of open and accessible research. You may also want to consider making your methodologies available and pre-registering your studies. This can be a great benefit for you. There's research that shows that studies that have been pre-registered and have open methodologies are more likely to be cited by other researchers, so it can benefit you in that respect. Jumping around a little. Okay, it's okay. So that is something that's helpful. That is an extra step, so not quite as important maybe as registering for an ORCID and some of the other things we're talking about, but still a very good thing that you can do when possible. Also, when possible, use open source as opposed to proprietary software, which makes it more likely that researchers who don't have access to proprietary software are able to use your data and models. I know we at NOAA, some offices have actually run into problems where research has been done and data is available in formats that we do not have the software to open and read, and we have to take extra steps. That can be a barrier to making your research accessible to people. So something to consider when you're doing that. I know that it's not always possible, but when it is, give it a try. Also make your code or models available. Among other things, this practice really promotes the replication of studies, and reproducibility is a key element of open science. Next slide, Jen. All right, so you should make sure that your data sets are archived and available prior to publication in any journal or other publication option. Many journals now allow you to link your data set or provide statements of availability, and we strongly suggest that you take advantage of those options. NOAA has a number of data repositories, including data.noaa.gov through NCEI, and the repository can link to data sets as well as other materials, which connects your publications to related data sets. And it's a really easy step to take to start to create that web of resources. Whenever you're creating documents, websites, etc., remember to think about accessibility. By this, we mean providing machine readable formats, so Section 8 compliant formats. Jen has produced a lot of materials, given a number of talks. You can check our YouTube page and our website. We have lots of information and also open office hours every Tuesday afternoon if you have questions about that particular subject. We might be sort of preaching to the choir here because we do talk about it a lot. So make use of public domain designations and publishing options. This includes publishing tech memos or selecting CC0 when licensing options are being selected. When you do publish in an open access journal, a gold open access journal that is, select the most open access license available. Ideally, that would be CC BY. Although that might not be available, and you can always reference materials on our website or slide 11 that Jen put together. And last but certainly not least, at least when we're talking, submit your journal article manuscripts and other publications to the NOAA IR. It is our favorite way to make research publicly accessible, and we do get a lot of people accessing that from the wider research community. And as a reminder, all of these steps are things that the library can help you with. We have a lot of resources online, which I'm going to talk about in just a second, but also you can always shoot us an email or pop into our office hours. Next slide. So just a few tools and resources if you want to dive deeper into some of the things we've talked about today. I'm only going to touch on the first few, but these slides will be made available so you can access them later. And they are all on our website, I believe, or will be. So I want to highlight the excellent guides that Jen has put together, both the Publishing and Scholarly Communications Guide and the ORCID for Researchers Guide are really excellent resources that are chock full of information. So if you're interested in publishing a tech memo or have questions about article processing charges or how to set ORCID, these guides are a really great first stop. They might answer your questions without having to, like, I don't know, talk to a human. But again, the library is here always to help with whatever your publishing needs are. We really are here to help everybody in NOAA across all lines, whatever your job. And I want to mention that we have an agreement with PLOS Climate, and the library will cover all NOAA author publication fees for publishing in that journal. We have more information about that and some instructions in our author guide, which is linked here, but it's a really great journal and it's a great opportunity to have that covered. We're really excited about it. Next slide. So just a couple things before we move on to questions. I'm going to gloss over it a little bit, but here's some information about International Open Access Week. We obviously care a lot about this in the library, especially with the IR team. This is a great opportunity to learn about and promote open access. We really want to increase participation at NOAA in every level and respect of open access. Next slide. And finally, this year's Open Access Week theme is Open for Climate Justice, which I think is especially meaningful for us at NOAA. I know climate justice is something that has come up a lot. We have a working group for climate justice. There's an OSTP working group for climate justice, but making our research open and publicly accessible at every stage and level is a big step and not a particularly onerous one that we can take as an organization and as individuals here to promote equity and really encourage collaboration and a sense of community. So we hope that we have given you the information that you need, or at least a starting point for that, to help us in this goal. And with that, I am done, and we will take questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah and Jen. Lots of information, and we do have some questions. So I'm just going to start with the first ones that came in earlier. So the first question is, should data be made available also in agency-designated repositories, for example, NCEI, or can other platforms be used? And if so, what's the criteria?
Great question, whoever asked this. So I'm going to run back through slides real quick. Bear with me. Yes, and especially per the new OSTP memo, the 2022 memo, there is some language in there that does lay out criteria for data repositories. We do have it on this tools and resources slide. Specifically, this very last bullet is the one that will make or that addresses this. There is a document called Desirable Characteristics of Data Repositories for Federally Funded Research. And within the OSTP memo, it calls out that data should be deposited in repositories that meet the NSTC recommendations. So if the repository that you're depositing in matches these recommendations, then you should be good to go. There has been some discussion, and I do think this will be part of the larger PAR discussion and sort of the revisions of the PAR plan as to, I don't want to call it like a good to go list or anything like that, but a list of acceptable or recommended repositories. Some agencies, like partners that we have at CDC, Department of Transportation, I think even Department of Energy, have sort of lists of repositories that they have okayed and said meet their standards. It is something that will be discussed. But if you know that the repository you are looking to deposit your data in meets these guidelines, you should be good. NCEI obviously is always sort of the preferred. I do know that NCEI does not take everything, but that's sort of always our recommendation for your first go-to place. If you are unsure, please feel free to contact us in the library, and we're happy to help you with that process to find an appropriate place to place your data.
Awesome. Thank you, Jen. Okay, moving on to that next question that came in. Are there tools to convert a Word file into something that is machine readable? And how does this requirement relate to figures, tables, and equations?
That is an excellent question, and I don't know if we have a great answer yet. So there are tools that you can use to convert PDFs and Word documents into machine readable formats. The real question that we are running into right now is what's the machine readable format that we want people to convert to? There are discussions currently amongst all the agencies that are subject to the OSTP policy uh, as to what format is the preferred one. Some agencies opt for XML, some opt for JSON, some go with, like NIH, go with JATS, which is sort of a flavor of XML from my experience, which is limited with JATS. So there's sort of different flavors of the formats, and that's where the real question comes in. I know that there are Python scripts where you can take a document and convert it into an XML version. I know converting from XML to JSON is a bit tricky, but converting from JSON to XML is a little bit easier. So there's some questions as to what's the appropriate format. Are there tools that can get you from one to the other? Yes. Do I have them off the top of my head? No. I can get those for folks if they're interested. It is something that we've talked about building out on some guides moving forward. What was the second part of the question, Katie?
How does this touch on figures, equations, tables?
Figures and equations. Yeah. So the secondary part of that, especially, so the nice part about this requirement is that machine readable versions of publications tend to be accessible versions more so than a PDF. So there's that. How, depending on what you're converting it from and into, can sort of impact tables, figures, things like that. However, I think it's a matter of tagging within those documents. So I don't have a great answer for that right off the top of my head. I can get that to someone, which I know will have access to these. So I can always follow up with that person, but it's good to know that people are thinking about this so I can get that information out to folks. So I'm sorry, that wasn't a horribly satisfying answer to that.
That's okay. As Jen said earlier, we will be following up with an email and we'll hopefully have some succinct answers to some of these questions. So our next question, does the zero embargo apply for copyrighted material?
Yeah, good question. So it's sort of yes and yes. So when you mean copyright material, I'm assuming we're talking about things that are like CC BY or things of that nature. So the zero embargo is really going to focus on accepted manuscripts. So if you have to submit to the IR an accepted manuscript, that's when the zero embargo comes into play. So when you give us that manuscript, we're going to make it available immediately. If it's a CC BY article, so something that there's copyright, but it's an open sort of copyright, right? That CC BY, CCNC, whatever it is. Those, we don't have to worry about that zero embargo because we can automatically make that available regardless. So I think if I understand the question correctly, and if not, please follow back up. Yes, it applies to those copyrighted materials because what we need is that manuscript version of the publication, and that's where the zero embargo comes into play.
Great. And if that wasn't what you were looking for, hopefully you will you'll clarify and resubmit your question. Okay, moving on to a next question. So this one, I'm going to massage the question a little bit, and it's about ORCID. So it's wondering, ORCID previously in the past apparently wasn't very good at helping researchers not upload duplicate entries. What's different now about ORCID?
Do you want to take that one, Sarah? You want me to? Okay. So there's a couple things about ORCID and why we kind of push ORCID a little bit. In terms of duplicate entries, I do think there are a few more additional mechanisms that allow you to sort of mitigate some of that. This will be sort of a long-winded answer to get back around to this, so bear with me. The reason we talk about ORCID so much is NOAA is a member of the ORCID consortium. The library has sort of, we've paid for our membership. We are a member of the U.S. government or U.S. federal government ORCID consortium, I think is the full name of the thing. But us and a number of, I think it's 20 other federal agencies are part of this consortium. And how this can help with some of that duplicate issue is we as an agency can actually help update your ORCID on your behalf. So you wouldn't have to worry about doing that. What we will do long term is we will ask you, the researcher, the ORCID holder, we'll say, for permission to read and write to your ORCID record. What that means is we would be able to A, pull down any information off of there that we would like to use, and B, when you publish something, we could update your ORCID record on your behalf. So this way we would have a full list of your publications. We could see if something's already on there and then just upload what needs to be put on there for you. This would all be done automatically. All you would have to do is give us permissions. Those permissions can be revoked at any point in time. So say you get mad at me and you don't want me to touch your ORCID anymore, that's okay. You can revoke my permission to do so, and then you can do it manually again. But there is an automated way for us to help you manage that to help mitigate duplicates. The reason that we focus on ORCID a lot right now is within the new OSTP memo, it does specifically call out a policy that came out at the very tail end of the previous administration. It's called NSPM 33, National Security Presidential Memorandum 33, on research security and integrity. NSPM 33 essentially requires all researchers who receive federal funding and employees to have a persistent identifier so that we can make sure people are who they say they are, and we can make sure that the funding we're giving out is going to the right person. So that's where ORCID ties in, because there are requirements laid out in NSPM 33 that currently ORCID is the only persistent identifier for people that meet those requirements. Does that mean in the future another company might come along and provide a better option? It's possible. But right now, ORCID's the only one who provides that. So I hope that answered your question. I do think ORCID has improved some of their processes. And I do think that there is a way to sort of mitigate any duplication, but also sort of our plans long-term for how we within the library and NOAA as a whole plan to integrate NOAA should help cut down on some of that duplication and, most importantly, remove some of that burden from authors, researchers, and staff within the offices who maintain and manage those things for their colleagues.
Thanks so much, Jen. I think it answered part of the question, and I think this is going to be a longer, more fruitful conversation offline. Hopefully others on the call as well are considering getting an ORCID and letting the library manage it now.
Yeah, so I will say, just to add on to that, the webinar that we're planning on doing in November is going to focus on this specifically, on ORCID specifically, and I do want to talk kind of in depth about sort of this management of folks' ORCID records and everything, and what we will be able to do, like what our capabilities will be, and how we can help folks and sort of partner on that.
Awesome. Okay. So moving on to our next question, and it's a long one, so I'm going to read through it. And Jen, Sarah asked me to repeat any part of it because I want to get it right. So our asker is saying that they work with data sets from around NIMS, but not all of them are individuals who are very willing and open to share their data following an internal data request. But all of these data should already be publicly available. Is there any policy of these guidelines to make data available? In my experience, individual researchers are not complying with making their data openly available. So I'm assuming he's asking, they are asking if the OSTP memo guidelines says something about data.
Yes, so there's a big data component in the new guideline, in the new memo, in the new requirements. I will say that I work and participate in the Data Governance Committee, the DGC. There is a lot of work happening within the DGC already prior to the memo coming out, but already in relation to data sharing policies, principles, those sorts of things. So there is a lot of work being done. In terms of specific existing policies right now, off the top of my head, I don't have anything. I do think there's one or two. There is the Data Citation Procedural Directive. That's a little bit more about getting DOIs and archiving your data sets. There is another policy that I can't think of, so I can look that up and share that with folks. We can share that in the follow-up email. Regarding data, but I will say this. There are a lot of things in motion in terms of data policy and especially in terms of data sharing. The new memo and its requirements are going to play heavily into this because there is a huge aspect of data sharing. That whole idea of having your data publicly available upon publication is really key, and it is going to be a big issue. It will be incorporated in any PAR revisions and any sort of data policy as well.
Okay, Jen, I'm going to clarify a little bit on that
Sure.
question. Thank you for all the policy information.
Mhm.
They're also wondering if there is any policing of these guidelines to make data available.
That's a really good question. Um, I can't say yes or no to that. What I can do is speak to what I do know, and that is currently a lot of that policing is left up to the office, the program. Um, However, uh, there are things like performance metrics and things that will be built into these new policies and these new guidelines. So right now, there is not a ton of policing and hand slapping. The same can be said for publications too. Um, there isn't necessarily a you broke the rules, you're going to get in trouble and thrown in data jail or whatever it may be yet. Does that mean that will always be the case? No, I don't think so. I think that that's one of the things is we want to make sure people are following these policies, and so coming up with sort of performance metrics for them. And this goes to publications as well. This is an issue on both sides of that coin, publications and data. So hopefully that answers it. It's not a satisfying answer for sure. That really no. Uh, that being said, it is something that, at least in terms of publications, what we do know and what is submitted to us, that information is reported to the Science Council. It is reported to NOAA leadership. Data will probably be approached in much the same way. It will be reported up. We also are required to report to OSTP upon request this information. So this does go up and through. The only entity that I know that is checking in and asking, how are we doing? What are our compliance rates? Is GAO, the Accountability Office. Government Accountability Office. They do check in on us very regularly, probably every 3 to 6 months. They check in to see how our implementation of our existing PAR plan is going and how our compliance has improved. So
Thanks, Jen.
mhm.
I think that answers that.
Okay.
So we have a couple more questions. One gets a little specific, and I don't know if you know this, and I am going to refer everyone back to that desirable characteristics of data repository for federally funded research. But Jen, do you know if GitHub specifically meets those requirements?
I don't off the top of my head. I would have to review it. I do know that a lot of things wind up on GitHub, not just from NOAA, but from multiple agencies. So it's a question that will come up. It's something that probably will need to be addressed. Currently, NOAA does not have any other sort of software or code repository. GitHub is kind of the place to do it. There are GitHub repositories. There is a NOAA specific GitHub repository, which, if someone has questions on that, they can contact me and I can put you in touch with the people who manage that. So to my knowledge, I don't know. I'm not sure if GitHub does. That being said, I know GitHub is a place where people are putting a lot of things, just because there is not necessarily the infrastructure internally within NOAA to handle those currently.
Thanks, Jen. And then talking again about data. Is it the expectation with making data open access and openly accessible, publicly accessible, that NOAA researchers will get data DOIs from NCEI?
Also an excellent question and something that is currently being worked on. So yes, to an extent, yes. NCEI does have requirements for what they can and cannot take, for what they can and cannot archive. If they can't archive it, they can't necessarily mint a DOI for that data. That being said, that's an issue because there are a number of things that NCEI can't take. There has been work through DGC. They established a data DOI task team. I was lucky enough to be a part of that and sort of help and advise on that, just because I deal with DOI publication DOIs and things of that nature. So there were some recommendations that have been put forth. They are actively being tried. We're at a point where folks are trying to act on those recommendations, where folks would be able to obtain a DOI for things not archived within NCEI. So my suggestion, I wouldn't say suggestion. So all I can say to that right this very second is please stay tuned. There will be information and guidance coming out related to that. If you have specific questions or would like a little bit more information on this, what we can do is direct you to your assistant CDO, your data officers within each of the assistant chief data officers within each of the line offices. I can get folks in contact with those people if need be.
Thanks so
Again,
much.
sorry, not a horribly satisfying answer, but we can get you in touch with who you need to make sure that those processes are being followed. But yes, there will be a solution long term for things not housed within NCEI to get a DOI, a NOAA DOI.
Thanks, Jen. It sounds like a lot of things are in flux, so people will need to stay tuned for that next seminar. We did have another attendee have a sort of answer about GitHub. They posted that GitHub does not allow a permanent DOI, and you have to link with Zenodo or other repositories for a DOI, so it shouldn't be used for long-term storage. That said, everybody should take a good look at GitHub or wherever they're posting material to make sure it is following those requirements.
Yes, thank you for whoever put that in there. The Zenodo link is key because GitHub does not provide a DOI. So Zenodo mints DOIs for things that are housed within GitHub. But again, that's sort of the issue with GitHub is there's no guarantee of long-term preservation and access.
And that is the end of the questions that I am seeing. So unless Jen or Sarah, you have any parting words, I will just confirm for everyone that we do have a seminar next month. It will be on November 16th, same time, 3 p.m. Eastern to 4 p.m. And there will be more information to come and a registration link sent out for that November 16th ORCID specific seminar. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. Take care and stay safe out there.